Hello everyone. We are continuing with the chapter of pollination and fertilization, and today we will study about the agents of cross pollination, and this is the C part of pollination and fertilization. In the previous session, you have studied about self-pollination and cross-pollination, their advantages and disadvantages. And in this session, we will study about the agents of cross-pollination. In cross-pollination, pollen grains from anther of one flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower. As you all know, children, in cross-pollination, the pollen grains from the anther of one flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower. The pollen grains need some abiotic or biotic agents. So, for the transfer of pollen grains, they require some biotic or abiotic agents such as wind, water, insects, birds, or animals to transport and bring about pollination. So, children, for the transfer of pollen grains, some biotic and abiotic agents are required. See here, this wind and water, they are the abiotic agents, and insects, birds, and animals, they are the biotic agents which help in the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. The most common agents are the wind and insects. Among all these, the common agents are wind and insects. It is also done artificially by the plant breeders for producing useful and better varieties. This cross pollination is brought about artificially by the plant breeders, or we can call it by the farmers, for producing useful and better varieties. Now, see this table here, these agents of pollination. Agents of pollination. And here in this table, we will study about the technical terms used for pollination. See here, this table is very important, children, and you have to study this. See, these are the agents of pollination, and these are the terms which are used for these different types of pollination. See, when the pollination takes place with the help of wind, it is known as anemophily. Water, hydrophily. Animals, it is known as zoophily. And in animals, when this pollination takes place with the help of insects, it is known as entomophily. Birds, ornithophily. Bats, that is cryopetrophily. Snails, malacophily, and by man it is known as artificial pollination. So children, this table is very important. These are the agents of pollination, and these are the technical terms which are used for these types of pollination. So children, now we will study about these different types of pollination. Anemophily, their characteristics. What are the characteristics of these types of pollination? Anemophily means when the pollination takes place with the help of wind, or when the agent of pollination is wind. Flowers are pollinated by wind have the following characteristics. So we will study about in this about the characteristics of this type of pollination. Usually they are neither large nor showy or bright colored. So the flowers they are not large, they are not showy, they are not bright colored. The corolla is usually small and inconspicuous. Now the corolla is not brightly colored and it is very, very small. They are not scented. So these flowers, they do not have nectaries, they do not produce any scent. The stamens having long filaments sway easily with the wind. See, the first characteristics is that the flowers are neither showy, they are not brightly colored, they are not scented. Secondly, the stamens have long filaments. The filaments are very long so that they can easily sway, or we can say they can swing in the wind very easily. The pollens are produced in a very large quantity. Another important characteristic is that the pollen grains are produced in a very large quantity. The pollen grains produced are very light in weight. They are usually provided with wings. See, the pollen grains are produced in large quantities. Secondly, the pollen grains produced are very light in weight, so that they can be easily carried away by the wind, and they are provided by wings. The stigmas are usually large and feathery. Now, this is all about the stamens and pollen grains. Now, see about the stigma. That the stigma is very large and feathery. The style is long enough to expose the stigma well above the flower. The style is also long so that it can expose the stigma above the flower. Often the flowers appear and mature before new leaves arise. See about the maturation about the flower. They mature before the new leaves arise. So before the arrival of the new leaves, these flowers they mature. It avoids interference by the leaves. To avoid the interference which is caused during pollination by these leaves, the flowers mature before the arrival of the new leaves. So these are the characteristics of anemophily, or the flowers which are pollinated by wind. Example is maize, bamboo, pine, etc. So these are the examples. Now, we will see here in this wind pollination in maize. In maize, the cluster of male flowers are borne at the apex. See, you can see here in this figure, these are the male flowers. They are borne at the apex of the flower. The female flowers are borne near the base in the axil of the leaf on the plants. You can see here in this axil, these flowers are borne. These are the female flowers which are borne in the axil, and these are the male flowers which are borne at the apex. The male flowers produce large quantities of pollen grains. As the anther bursts, the light and dry pollen grains are blown by the wind. So these male flowers, they produce large quantities of pollen grains, and when this anther bursts, they the light and dry pollen grains, they are blown by the wind. Many of them land on the silky and feathery stigmas of the neighboring plants, hence bringing about the cross pollination. Now see what happens. This when this see plants are this are the plant is having the male flower, and here you can see the female flowers. And when this anther burst open, the pollen grains are released. They are very light, they are easily blown by the wind, and they land on the stigma, on the feathery stigma of the neighboring plants, thus bringing about the cross pollination. So this is all about anemophily. The second type of pollination we can see here is hydrophily, which is brought about by water. Flowers are pollinated by water in case of aquatic plants such as Hydrilla, Vallisneria, etc. So pollination which is brought about by water is known as hydrophily, and it takes place in all the aquatic plants. Now, in case the following characteristics are found. So now we will study about the characteristics of hydrophily. Plants are dioecious, flowers are small and inconspicuous. They are not scented as well. The plants are dioecious, that means male and female flowers are borne on different plants. They are not scented. Pollen grains are produced in large quantities. The pollen grains have the same specific gravity as that of water, so that they can float in water. So the pollen grains are produced in large quantities. They have the same specific gravity so that they can easily float in water. In some cases, the male flowers detach and float on water till they meet the female flowers. Now what happened? The male flowers, they get detached from the flower and from the plant, and they float till they reach the female flower. In Vallisneria, pollination is very interesting. The plants are dioecious. The female or the pistillate flowers have long stalks. See, pistillate or the female flowers have long stalks, whereas the male or the staminate flowers have short stalks and are submerged in water. They are submerged. Before pollination, the male flowers detach from the parent plant, as you have seen here in this characters in this above characteristics, that the male flowers, they get detached from the parent plant. They are carried by the water currents up to the female flowers. In this way, pollination takes place when the anther bursts open, setting the pollen grains free after striking the stigmas. So when they strike the stigmas, what happened? The anthers burst, releasing the pollen grains, which are released on the stigma, and in this way pollination takes place. So children, this is all about hydrophily. The third type of pollination is zoophily. Zoophily means this pollination is brought about by the animals, is known as zoophily. And here we have seen here in the agents of pollination about the different types of animals which helps in pollination. So here we will study about this. Cross pollination caused by animal is called zoophily. Depending upon the agents used, cross pollination is characterized as entomophily, that means by the help of insects, ornithophily by the birds, criopetrophily by bats, malacophily by the snails, and artificially, which is brought about by the man, is known as artificial pollination. So here we will study about the pollination brought about by the insects, which is known as entomophily. Day blooming flowers. Day blooming flowers means the flowers which bloom during the daytime. Day blooming flowers have either very bright colored attractive corolla. So all the day blooming flowers, they have very brightly colored corolla. Example is crotalaria, small florets grouped into a head, that is sunflower, or some other conspicuous features like colored bracts, like in bougainvillea, so as to attract the insects. See, the corolla is brightly colored. Sometimes the bracts are also colored as in bougainvillea to attract the insects. Night blooming flowers are often white colored but strongly scented, example jasmine, coffee, etc. See, night blooming flowers, they are not brightly colored, but they are often white in color, but they are strongly scented so that they can attract the insects during the night for pollination. Example is jasmine and coffee. Flowers have nectaries which secrete nectar, a sugary fluid. All these day blooming flowers and night blooming flowers, they have nectaries so that they can produce nectar, which is another reason to attract the insects. The insects which come in search of nectar also carry pollen grains from one flower to another. Such flowers are called nectar flowers. So these insects, they visit the flower for nectar, and they carry the pollen grains from one flower to another flower. The flower produce a small number of pollen. See, we have seen in this anemophily, which are pollinated by wind, flowers which are pollinated by wind, they produce large amount of pollen grains, and the pollen grains are also very light in weight. They have wings so that they can be easily blown away by the wind. But here in this entomophily, we see here the pollen grains are produced in a smaller quantity or in a small amount. The insect visit these flowers to eat the pollen grains which serve as food for them. See, the insect visit the plant flowers to eat the pollen grains and which serve as food for them. So insect visit the plant for nectar, for taking nectar, then to eat the pollen grains, which serves as a food for them. The pollen grains have rough, sticky surface. The pollen grains are not smooth, they are rough and they have a sticky surface. The surface of a stigma is also sticky, as in the flowers of China rose, lotus, roses, etc. See, the stigma is also sticky so that it can so that the pollen grains may stick to the stigma and further helps in fertilization. So the example of entomophily are China rose, lotus, and roses. So these are the examples of flowers which are pollinated by insects. So children, here this in salvia is also one example which is pollinated by insects. This is Pisum sativum, that is P, is another flower which is pollinated by wind. So today we here end the session, and in another session we will study about the another type of pollination. Thank you.